We are back on the Zero Hour. Joining us once again is George Dvorsky, who is a bioethicist, a transhumanist, futurist, all those things, and also a contributing editor at io9.com, which if you haven't seen it, is an extremely cool website. Producer of the Sentient Developments, that is, blog and podcast. And he's here to talk. First of all, let me welcome you, George. Thanks for joining us.
Hey, thanks for having me once more.
Oh, my pleasure. Now, you wrote a piece that, we hear a lot of ideas thrown around in the world of forecasting, but this was an interesting one to me. This was intriguing. That the headline in IO9 was, how much longer before companies start to run themselves? And of course, the first thought that came into my mind was, at last, corporate personhood. Mitt Romney will be so happy. But before we get to that, why don't you tell me a little bit, for the sake of our audience, what you were talking about there?
Sure. A few years ago, in the depths of the Bitcoin chat rooms, a bunch of guys started to talk about the possibility of designing corporations that are fully autonomous. That is, corporate entities that really don't require any kind of corporate or oversight or governance, not at least at the human level. And what they suggested was that simply by setting up some basic rules, in a way setting up a kind of mission statement for a corporation, you don't really necessarily need people like a board of directors to actually make the corporation work. So just in a nutshell, really what they were talking about is creating algorithms. We're not talking even the most sophisticated kind of AI. In fact, it's very unsophisticated. It's just strictly a set of rules that would, in a way, execute upon a mission statement. And that before you know it, we could actually have corporations that are, in essence, actually running themselves.
Now, I'm glad that, first of all, that you said it's not necessarily AI, because that was something I was going to bring up, too, that this, in fact, from a design point of view, is not blue sky stuff. This is the kind of stuff that people have been looking at and working on for a long time. This is close to existing technology. I'm not sure it would is completely doable now, but it's certainly completely not blue sky as far as I can tell as a technology challenge. Is that fair to say, you think?
I think that's very fair to say, and in fact, there are a number of individuals and small, entrepreneurial companies that are working to develop both the immediate technologies required to create these entities, but also some of the back end structures to make it work as well. And not surprisingly, a lot of these individuals are coming from the Bitcoin community who have been really inspired by that technology. Just very quickly, Bitcoin is a digital currency out there that in a way can be seen as a kind of prototypical version of these kinds of these systems, which are referred to as these digital or distributed autonomous corporations. And in a way, Bitcoin actually encourages users to work in a certain way, to trade amongst themselves, to earn Bitcoins, and so on and so forth. And they got inspired thinking that, the corporations could actually work in the same sort of a way, where humans could be inspired to, let's say, perform a certain function within the company to make it work, whether it be selling bicycles or sending out gift cards or some kind of service-based sector. And again, using the Bitcoin model, which is very, very well established right now, these individuals are seeking to create a kind of autonomous corporation. So yes, to answer your question, we're not talking radically advanced technologies by any means, but one thing I'm certainly hoping to get to over the course of this chat is the potential for more sophisticated, more AI-like corporations.
Well, I think we can get to that. We're talking with futurist George Dvorsky about whether corporations could ever run themselves. Here's, and there might be a slight divergence of opinion or a bigger one between you and me on the issue of Bitcoin as an economic or public entity. However, I would say that I think this notion, what intrigues, one of the things that intrigues me about this notion is that if you set the technology aside for a second, essentially what the modern corporation is an autonomous entity seeking to expand its own profitability and power based on pre-written rules. You touch on this a little bit in your piece, but to me, this, for example, is not as radical an economic or regulatory or political departure, for example, as Bitcoin is. It is, in fact, just the continuance of war, is the continuance of politics by other means. I would say that an autonomous digital corporation is just the continuation of corporations by other means.
I think that's fair. I don't necessarily disagree with that. Where you start to get some deviations in terms of what we're accustomed to, of course, is now we're not dealing with the governorship at the top of the corporation. There's no board of directors, so to speak. Even though the company is, for example, still subject to ownership and shareholders and so on, because they're the ones that are clearly going to be meeting the benefits, the profits of the company. Again, the corporation is not a means unto itself. There has to be people making money off it. One of the concerns about a DAC, though, is that very few people would actually be making money from its activities, because rather than, let's say, giving money to a suite of workers or even to, let's say, the board of directors or to a CEO, the money will be trickling out to anyone who's invested into the company or who is actually participating in the functioning of the company. So the danger here is this ongoing process towards what's referred to as technological unemployment. This runs the risk of unemploying and underemploying both blue collar and white collar, across the board, even at the CEO and upper echelon level. So, yes, you're correct in suggesting that it doesn't really change this kind of autonomous or self-directed, in a way, direction that companies do take. Companies do take on a life of their own after a while, and much to really operate in a way to serve the needs of the shareholders. But certainly, it does stand to upset, I think, some of the more conventional aspects of what we're used to when dealing with corporations.
So here's what makes this a fascinating idea to me, George Dvorsky, futurist, which is the Distributed Autonomous Corporation, or DAC as it calls it, which is it allows us to have a debate about the nature of corporations themselves. For example, you said that just now, corporations exist to serve the interests of their shareholders. Even that in the modern corporation is often no longer true. You often see people, executives and boards of directors abusing the long-term health of the corporation in order to extract short-term payment for it for themselves. So while I agree with you about the negative social impact should something like this come to pass, it would also, interestingly enough, potentially offset some of the perverse incentives of the corporate CEO and corporate boards as they now exist. And it might even reduce inequality by getting rid of highly overpaid CEOs. But that said, it would definitely lead to increased human unemployment. And in economic terms, it would, I think, increase our transition from a working economy to something that might be, in economic terms called a rentier economy, where people who are able to invest capital are going to prosper more than people who work for a living.
What's interesting about what you're saying as well, it just reminded me that back in terms of the discussion of shareholders and control of the company, when it comes to establishing the parameters under which your DAC is going to work, you could actually make the rules or the mission statement such that it has to adhere to certain business standards, to the laws of the land, if you will. And you could even embed a certain amount of ethics into it that it can't violate. So it would not be privy to, human foibles and greed and deception. It would, in fact, one could make a case that these autonomous systems would be far more moral and far more ethical and even potentially pro-social than corporations today that have a kind of human level of ownership. And that's the thinking here, is that once these mission statements or utility functions will be embedded into these systems, they will be open source, they will be known to the larger community, because they will be in many ways driven by, like I said, the laws of the land. They'll also be transparent, and the system itself should not be allowed to modify itself, which kind of even gets back to issues of artificial intelligence now, and whether or not we should allow AI, for example, to be able to reprogram itself, to change its goals, to change its ethics and directives, and so on. So there's little tricks that might be possible in the background.
Well, and before we get to that, it's just interesting that you talk about ethics, because you quote BitShare's Stan Latimer as devising the 3 laws of robotics, which a lot of our listeners will know from Isaac Asimov, for these DACs, or distributed autonomous corporations. But they are: 1, it must always obey its own published business rules. It cannot change its rules. 2, without consent of the share stakeholders. 3, it must protect its own existence as long as such protection does not conflict with the first 2 laws. Nothing in there about obeying the law.
No, I mean, and you're right. It all will come down to its initial set of programming, and who's going to actually give it the rules, and who is allowed to change those rules over time. And one of the fears is that, sure, 99.9% of, let's say, all entrepreneurs who are setting up these DACs, they're ethical and they want nothing but what's good for the world and for the society around them. But you might have some unscrupulous thinkers and some developers who are greedy and are not going to adhere to these standards. And they could, for example, work to create monopolistic systems for their DACs. They could work to maybe snoop on other corporations, to undermine them, engage in cyber attacks and other kinds of unethical cyber campaigns, and so on. Similarly, they could also fudge the programming such that the DAC will, in fact, be able to modify itself, which would be exceptionally dangerous, particularly if we're talking about, let's say, DACs decades from now that will be embedded with a certain level of artificial intelligence, where they can start to make decisions autonomous of humans and human rulemaking, and start to perhaps maybe misconstrue or perhaps go the extra mile to go about fulfilling its mission statement. So it could actually work to destroy, let's say, other corporations. It could actually work to destroy its competition, or it could even potentially misconstrue its set of instructions in a way that could be dangerous to our infrastructure, that could, for example, take over the energy grid, or start to reconstitute the matter of our planet into dangerous ways, and so on.
So it's sounding more and more like the Koch brothers, as you describe it. And so we have 2 category of autonomous corporation here. Then the one that's programmed, to paraphrase Jessica Rabbit, I'm not bad, I'm just programmed that way. And the second that, unfortunately, we only have a couple minutes left. We can't go deeply into the artificial intelligence debate now. But one of the things that always strikes me is that we always talk about how we want to limit the ability of artificial intelligence to do A, B, or C. So should such a thing ever come to pass, in the minute we got left, how do we stop it?
Well, that's an open question, isn't it? And I wish I actually had a really great answer for you there. I think most practically, we need to be talking about it like you and I are right now, and get the word out and make sure that people are aware that this is actually a thing, that this is actually happening, and that we've got people working on this right now. But I also feel that we need to start talking about creating those initial set of rules and guidelines, creating maybe even licensing regimens in terms of who and who cannot create DACs, and of course talking about how are we going to enforce this in a legal sort of a way? How are we going to get political people on board? What kind of oversight committees can we have to make sure that these run safely? And ultimately, work in conjunction, I would say, with the artificial intelligence community in terms of finding solutions for ensuring that these things will always be safe and controllable from a human perspective.
That sounds like a very sane approach, and unfortunately, we're going to have to leave it there. But a fascinating topic, and enjoyed discussing it with you, George Dvorsky, futurist and bioethicist. Thanks so much for coming on the program.
Absolutely, my pleasure.
And we will be right back after this. I'm Richard. RJ Eskow, and corporations, they're people, my friend. This is the Zero Hour.